So welcome to our 10th meetup of Health Dev Hub and FHIR Meetup. So it's dedicated to Smart on FHIR in the wild. So people will share the experience with the Smart on FHIR and the benefits you can get from Smart on FHIR. Again, so this is a new community which is called Health Dev Hub. It's about FHIR and plus about any topic in health tech. You're welcome to join. They're pretty interesting experts there, and so let's move this community forward. So, and yeah, we have a lot of speakers, and we will have like 20 minutes, like 15 minutes talk and 5 minutes for Q&A. And at the end, let's have some like hour discussion. So, and to be on the schedule, so let's start from Gasper. So to not take your time, so speakers, let's introduce yourself. Let's start.
So just like everyone else, today I'm going to talk about FHIR, more specifically Smart on FHIR. And at the start, I'm not going to bore you with an introduction just yet. So right now, judge me by what I say and not by who I am. Seeing as I'm the first one at this webinar, it makes sense for me to do kind of an introduction to Smart on FHIR, although Josh gave an important one already. Basically, it's a framework to integrate health apps, or more specifically, those applications that have FHIR underneath. And basically, it specifies stuff such as the single sign-on, how to obtain the FHIR resources, how access control is enforced, scopes, etc. And one way of using this framework is context launching. Basically, what context launching is opening an app within an app and taking the context with you. Let's say that here on the screen is something that presents, it's an illustration of an EMR. So you have a logged in clinician and you have some data that the clinician fills in inside the EMR. And the idea is that the clinician can continue using the EMR that they're fond of. They know exactly where the data comes from. They know exactly what to put in. And once they do that, once they do stuff within the EMR, they press on a button called launch. And what that does is that opens another application, so your application. And it launches it in an iframe, but more importantly, it takes the whole context with you. So the whole context that you filled in inside an EMR is automatically passed down, meaning that the SSO happened, the user is logged in, and everything that the clinician filled in inside the EMR is automatically populated at the second app. And then we proudly call this integration. Even though some may say, mostly the tech people on the call may say that this is an outdated and dull kind of integration because it's an iframe kind of integration. But in the kind of the rigid ecosystem that is the health IT, this is kind of a big thing, be that as it may. But basically, it presents two key benefits. One key benefit is that we know that clinicians don't want to switch between different contexts. They don't want to log out and log in to a new application, and they want to continue using applications that they're fond of and they know how to use. They can continue using the application and don't need to switch between them. And another key benefit is that this presents kind of a compromise between the vendor lock-in phenomena that we know that these big EMR vendors had just a couple of years ago when the whole data was locked in a proprietary model. So it's a compromise between that and kind of a fully open platform. And Smart on FHIR on top of the context launching that provides kind of a framework that tells you how the context launching should happen. It's a perfect thing to have with that. So basically what Smart on FHIR does, it describes how context should be passed, how security and access control is enforced, and basically in what way are the IDP and the EMR's clinical data repository kind of tightly coupled. So what was our use case? We have a solution called collaborative decision making, which is basically an online solution for multidisciplinary tumor boards. It streamlines the process around that. It makes sure all the data is properly gathered and reviewed, and it makes sure that the relevant clinical data at the end is also pushed to the correct patient repositories. All of that is happening. The project is in the Netherlands. Basically, we have built a regional collaboration platform that right now consists of 6 hospitals, but more importantly for this webinar, there are 3 different EMRs that we have integrated into. But more importantly, we have a clear vision and goal to scale this further, so we definitely didn't want to make a solution with which we would limit only to those 3 EMR vendors. And for example, with the same solution, albeit for a different purpose, we have also integrated with Cerner, for example. So basically what our solution is, it follows a variety of steps. And the first step is that the clinician needs to gather all relevant clinical documentation for the tumor board. And this is already where the Smart on FHIR comes in handy, because the clinician can do that, as I said, using the EMR that they're fond of. They know where each data comes from. They know how to prepare the patient demographics information. They know where and how to fetch the documents that are relevant for the tumor board. So they do that all within the EMR. And so the first step kind of presents an ease into our application. So once the user does that, once they prepare everything relevant for the tumor board, the so-called request data, they press on a button called Launch Vitally, Vitally being a name of our platform. Now, this is when the magic happens. So our application is invoked in an iframe, so a general HTTP GET, with an additional launch parameter. This is per Smart on FHIR spec. And that launch parameter contains some gibberish that the IDP and the EMR knows how to resolve to actually return you the context that the clinician prepared at first. So when our application is invoked, we do an identity brokering to the EMR's IDP. And because the clinician was logged into that IDP, the single sign-on automatically happens because the session already exists. So what happens? The IDP logs you in, issues you a token, but additionally, it's the IDP that gives you the context that the clinician had within the EMR. And the context is presented in terms of FHIR resource IDs. So right now, what do we have? We have a user that's completely logged in based on the SSO, so no additional login was required. And we have a set of FHIR resource IDs that present the EMR context. So the next logical thing, of course, is for us to resolve those FHIR resources so that we actually get the data that the user filled in, and we do that the standard FHIR way. And the next step is us having a fully logged in user, as well as the whole set of FHIR resources that present the context. So this was standard. This was plug and play Smart on FHIR. And you could, up until here, really code your software following this and expect it to work for everyone, for every vendor that supports Smart on FHIR. But after getting the context, after getting the data that presents the context, it's really like a Wild West. And the reason is because that context can be presented in a variety of different resources per vendor. So vendors have every right to model their data, for example, with an encounter, whilst the other EMR can map it to an appointment, the third one to an observation, and there's really nothing you can do about it. Because unless there's a FHIR implementation guideline or a FHIR profile that tells you exactly that for this use case that you're covering, EMRs need to use these FHIR resources, they can do whatever they please. And our example was that they really did whatever they pleased. So one EMR presented us with one set of resources for the context, another one with another set of resources for the context, etc. And that brings us to a solution that we have created. And we have created kind of a solution that's flexible and adaptable to all that. So whatever set of FHIR resources we get, we are able to somehow make sense of that data. And how we do that is to set it on a common denominator. So our solution to be effectively launched, effectively context launch, requires 3 data blocks, so to say. We require the patient information, we require the general tumor board data, and we require the request form, which is question answer fields. And as I said, we didn't want to limit ourselves only to those 3 EMRs, so we had to make up with a solution that would cater to a variety of different EMRs. So to illustrate a problem that we have faced, for example, the first EMR presented the context with the patient ID and the encounter ID. And those 3 blocks that you see here present the data blocks that we required to resolve and are presented in an integration steps. So the first integration step was the resolving of the patient demographics. And we did that with the general read on the patient resource with the patient ID. And whatever we got back sufficed for the patient data block. The second integration step was obtaining the general tumor board data. And the vendor behind the EMR, or rather the hospital that was using the EMR, told us that the general tumor board data would be presented in the encounter resource. So we did the read of the encounter. And whatever we got back we parsed and we fetched that data, or rather with FHIR extracted the data that was relevant to us. And then in the third integration step, there was the request form, so the question and answers that we needed to get. And for that, they told us that we need to do a search on observations, and that we need to do it with a fixed query parameter, smart data being the category, and also the patient and the encounter ID. What was the result was a couple of observations that presented those request forms, so all 3 data blocks were successfully obtained. Then the second EMR was already a bit more complex. We were presented with the task ID, and they told us that if we want to get the patient demographics, we first need to do a read on the task, and then we need to extract the patient reference from the task to do a read on the patient. So these were kind of 2 integration steps that we needed to do to fetch the patient data block that we required. And the general tumor board data and the request form were all kind of combined in one integration step. We had to do a search on observations with the specified code, and based on the auth token, they also knew which context this is about. What was the result was a couple of observations, and we had to differentiate between them because one of those specified the general tumor board data, and the other set of those specified the request form. Now the third one, that was a jungle. Like, it had an encounter with the link to observation, with the link to an appointment, with the link to the patient. But to get all that, you first needed to do a post on a condition. I'm just kidding, like, this didn't really happen. But the point is that it could, right? And it would all be per spec. It would be legit FHIR modeling. Legit, arguably, but still it would be FHIR modeling that if an EMR decided to do it that way, they could model it that way. And they could present the context in that way. Because one EMR can think of one way, and the other EMR can think of a different way of how to model the context that we require. And so you really need to, when you're covering that part, you really need to strive to develop your solution in an agnostic and pragmatic kind of way, so you don't limit yourself to just one vendor and one set of FHIR resources that could present you with the context. So what we did do, in short, we did a configurable and flexible way of how to configure those integration blocks. So both how to obtain the right data with a variety of integration steps, as well as how to make sense of that data. And this was all done with the proprietary JSON configuration that strongly depended on FHIR. But the idea is that nothing is fixed, nothing is hard-coded, and nothing is vendor or project specific. And this example can be seen here, where on the right-hand side, you can see the JSON configuration for resolving of the first data blocks of the patient. Basically, what we tell our code with this is that the patient is going to be resolved in 2 integration steps, which are represented with the steps being an array here. The first integration step, we're going to do a read on the encounter, and we're going to do a read based on the original context ID. So this is the constant that was given to us as part of the Smart on FHIR launch. The response cardinality expected is 1, which is logical because it was a read, so the first or the only one response was taken. And once that integration step was complete, the second integration step was to parse, or rather to extract the relevant patient reference within the encounter. So we fetch the participant where the type is patient, and we check for the individual of that and the reference. And then we did a read on that patient. So these are kind of 2 integration steps by how to obtain the patient. But this really all is flexible, and purely with JSON configuration, we found out an adaptable context launching mechanism. Like, the first test of this was already for this project, because we implemented all this in advance before we were even given access to those EMRs. And I'm proud to say that we were able to cover all those 3 EMRs, including the 4th one, so Cerner, with no additional development, purely with configuration of that JSON. But of course, the real test of this will be when we actually scale further in other regions and with other EMRs. So how much is plug and play? That was one of the questions. And as I said, when it comes to the Smart on FHIR, it really is. We have integrated with all 4 different EMRs, and we didn't need to change anything when it comes to the stuff that the Smart on FHIR covers. Like, sure, there are some differences, especially in terms of scopes, or perhaps in terms of how strict the IDP is in terms of validating, for example, the audience parameter, etc. But all that is minor. Generally speaking, I think that if you have developed a Smart on FHIR compliant capability for your product, good chances are that you won't need to adapt it for any such compliant vendor, EMR vendor. But as I said, then comes the content part. So the part that comes after Smart on Fire. And with that, basically anything goes. Now, if we circle back to the beginning, all this is a project called DDMN. As I said, it's a regional MDO collaboration platform involving 6 hospitals and 3 different EMRs. And the fact is that we ended up with just one installation covering all that and just having 6 different configurations, because even different hospitals can use the same EMR, but different modeling of the context. And it works. And we're pretty confident that we will be able to support different EMRs in different regions purely with configuration. And now the least important thing, the thing that I didn't do at the beginning, I am Gasper Andrejc. I'm health IT domain lead at Parsec, which is an open line company with offices in Slovenia, UK, and Netherlands. We have a variety of use case driven solutions for care pathways, for multidisciplinary tumor boards, for patient portals. But the thing is that all of those have a strong interoperable core underneath, which is also the core that made this whole integration possible. Otherwise, I have been working in the health ID for roughly 8 years, lately more and more with structured standards such as FHIR and OpenAir. But of course, I'm daily involved with 827 and IHE standards and profiles as well. Anyhow, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I hope I'm not too long, and I'm looking forward to discussing this more throughout the webinar.
Yeah, thank you, Gasper. You're just in time. So can you tell how much long it took to implement these integrations, like year, less?
I mean, we had some capabilities done up front because our platform is FHIR compliant from the very start. So the thing that we needed to code is to have this whole flexible way of resolving those resources. And that didn't take too long because you have the FHIR path for extracting the resources, purely technical. You have reflection on Java that helps you with that as well, the Happy FHIR one. So I wouldn't say it took a year, but it did take like 2 quarters, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And for the Smart on Fire part, we have an IDP which is Keycloak. We use Keycloak for that. And the Smart on Fire part was out of the box worked with Keycloak. I think we needed to extend it a bit because we needed to forward the launch parameter with the identity brokering, but that was minor as well.
Mm-hmm. So you can classify it still like successful application of Smart on Fire. So small data massage and everything works, yeah?
Yeah.
Almost everything. Okay.
I have a question on just the Smart on Fire part. You mentioned Keycloak as your IDP provider, right? So are you not launching, like when we integrate with EHRs or EMRs, however you want to call it, we create a launch endpoint for that specific EHR/EMR. And then once we launch with their launch endpoint, we get 2 query params, right? We get a launch query param, which is gibberish, but you have to pass it in the authorization endpoint because that's to match whatever is passed in. And then we also get the issuer URL, which is the FHIR server you're hitting, right? So, but we don't specify like, oh, we're using the IDP provider Keycloak or Okta or OAuth0, whatever, because we're using whatever IDP provider they're using because we're creating launch server URL for their FHIR server. We're using their FHIR server. For your implementation, how are you integrating EMRs and specifying what IDP provider you can use? That's where I'm kind of confused.
Yeah, so our solution uses its own identity provider, and this is Keycloak. And we use this for our own user management and everything with that. But a functionality of Keycloak enables you to do an identity brokering to an external IDP, meaning that once a user unauthenticated came to our solution, the user was automatically redirected to the IDP that we have configured as part of the identity brokering. And the launch and the gibberish and the audience, so the FHIR server URL was automatically passed to that IDP. Once the EMR's IDP issued an authorization token and what was the other one? So the authorization token and I think the JWT token, that was stored inside Keycloak. And when we needed to do the fetch to the FHIR server, we had to exchange tokens. So we had to exchange the Keycloak token that it issued for us, our users, with the token that the Keycloak stores that came from EMR's IDP, if that makes sense.
Kind of makes sense. Where I'm just lost is like when we launch authorization endpoint for one of our EMRs, we get a login page that we can't like avoid, like skipping. No matter what, like we could have our own IDP provider on our end, right, to exchange tokens, verify, all that. But before we even get there, you still have to launch their IDP, process based on the authorization URL that is configured in a well-known configuration endpoint, right? That you hit that, then if you specify response type equals code, you use the OIDC flow with or without Pixie, right? And then you hit the token endpoint with the authorization code. If you go that way, or the code type could be, it doesn't have to be authorization code. But the point is, like, I don't understand how you can skip that.
We don't really skip that, but so you're talking about why the SSO didn't happen for you. So
yeah, exactly.
The user, So the thing is that when users are using EMR, the EMR is connected to the same IDP that you're later going to when you do the Smart on Fire launch. So the session already exists for the EMR because the EMR is connected to their IDP and the session is intact and exists. Then when they launch your solution, you redirect the user agent. So actually the EMR, you redirect the EMR because your application opened in an EMR, you redirect the EMR back to their IDP. So, and because the session exists already, their IDP automatically issues you a token without presenting you with another login.
Okay, Gasper, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Awesome presentation, and we move further. Let me welcome Vlad.
Yeah, so my name is Vlad, and I'm software engineer at Health Samurai, and I was involved time to time in developing Smart on Fire on top of 8box. And today I want to share with you some implementations we made to support it and in our solution. And Smart on Fire, as an extension of OAuth 2.0, explains how user may share the rights he has on the resources with an external smart applications. And for us, this means that your implementation of Smart on Fire has to respect security policies applied in your current system. And there are many of security policies may be applied. For example, patient can see only its own clinical data or also clinical data of clinical data of their children, or practitioner may see all clinical data in the system, not financial data, or practitioner can see only clinical data within organizations they work at. And there are many other policies you may find. And in this talk, I want to walk through some implementations and see how they may evolve in light of Smart on Fire coming. And the first option you can start with is an ad hoc solution. Authorization in this case is hard-coded in your business logic. And it's pretty easy to develop this one, but it's pretty hard to maintain it eventually. And you may come with an idea that authorization should be dedicated in your solution. And there are two different approaches depending on what you put in the center of your access control. Will it be operation or resources? For example, if you put, if you start with operation, you may find that policy engine approach may work for you pretty well. And let me show you how it implemented in 8box. The idea is that you may create access policy resource, and the purpose of authorized method in 8box is to execute them on every incoming request. And if at least one access policy accepted the request, then the whole request is considered authorized. And let's have a look at the specific example. So here we can see policies for patient. So patient can see its own encounters. We enabled here Macho engine, which is like a pattern for incoming request. So we just check that we accept get request for encounter URL, and we expect to see here parameter patient, which should match patient ID in user resource. And we accept only requests from patient portal by this policy. And if you want to enable Smart on Fire for the same operation or the same endpoint, we can just create a copy of this policy and update a few fields. For instance, we may say that this operation can be performed by any client who has type smart application, and there is encounter read scope should be presented in session related to access token issued for this specific smart application. And the biggest pros of this approach is that it looks pretty simple to implement, and it really does. It's also easy to track what exactly policies allowed request. It's also easy to add new policies because you need just to create new resource in the system and it will be applied immediately in runtime. Simplicity really drives it and make pretty good level of confidence in your access control if you go with this solution. But this has pretty important downside, and it requires your smart applications to know exactly what endpoints and what parameters they should pass in the request to get the response. And if you have a control over your applications, over your clients, like for example, you develop smart application yourself, then this approach may work for you pretty well. But for example, if it's not possible for you and you want to set up some existing smart application and you don't have control over requests they can send, then you may find that it will not work for you. And when we made this feature request to support external smart applications, we were looking for a solution which is not far from access policy engine idea. And we thought, what if our access control would be able to manipulate with incoming requests? And we came to idea to develop a number of middlewares. You can just turn it on or off, and we implemented in those middlewares predefined security models. For example, if we can see request for encounter and we find a link to the patient ID, we just enhance this request with patient parameter and allow this request to be performed. It smells like ad hoc solution in some way, and unfortunately, there is only one way to configure this. You can just turn on middleware or off this one. But if you want to implement your own middleware, for example, with 8box, for now, it's not possible. And then we turned to another poll, another idea how we can implement security policies. We came to access control list. So the idea is that you put not operation in the center of your access control, but resources. You just specify users and resources and relationship between them, defining what user has access to what data. And you may think like putting authorization layer between business logic and persistent layer. So we implemented this solution with 8box API constructor, and here you can see an example of search operation over encounter resource. So here we just redefined an operation and said that we want to enable ACL search operation, FHIR operation for encounter resource, and we enabled here ACL filter, which you can find below. And depending on what user came via this request, we define different filters. And you can see below how it looks like. For example, if we go and get encounter with no additional parameters and our system finds user patient ID in the incoming token, it just adds where close to the resulting query, and we just look here for only encounters which belongs to the patient. But if practitioner comes and tries to run the same request, we run another filter, apply another filter here, and checks that, for example, in this case, practitioner should be general practitioner for the specific patient. Then he can see all encounters of them. You may ask how Smart on Fire can be implemented here, and my answer would be still access policies, but more simpler one. So you can just specify the same macho engine policy, and because you need to check if the smart application still has appropriate scope to run this operation. And then all other ACL filtering will be applied underline. The pros of this solution, I would name that it allows you to specify filters and enables filtering inside while running the request, because you can just filter all data in one request and not run like few requests to validate authorization. But the biggest issue with this solution, as I can see, it's hard to understand and start working with this, because you need to understand the concept which was developed. It's not so hard, but still has high threshold. And here, like researching what we can do with this, how we can create a more simple DSL for ACLs. We were researching for across the internet, across white papers, and run into Zanzibar solution. Maybe you're familiar with this. Zanzibar was presented by Google, and this is like authorization system created by them, and which was presented 4 years ago. And they say that it is a global system for storing and evaluating access control lists. And what we really liked about this is that they specify pretty nice language to describe your models. For example, they split configuration into 2 parts. The first one, you need to specify your model, your data model. For example, you can implement here FHIR model, and then you specify tuples. There are like relationship between your data. And in this example, we just defined a document with name readme and specify just few roles like viewer and owner. And we said that Bob and Alice, we said in our system that Bob and Alice can view this document, and also can view the document all members of engineering group. And then we specified that Dave is a member of this group. And once we specified all those tuples, we can run checks and validate what document is available for what person. And it runs also transition logic, like we can check that Dave, as a member of engineering group, also can view the document. Actually, Zanzibar and similar solutions is still, I'm still researching this one. I ran into this recently, and I feel that this one may be pretty promising for FHIR model, for FHIR solution, because it looks like we try to share with our customers more simple and more clear FHIR API, and we want to run all hard security policies inside, just sharing, exposing more easy API for them. And in conclusion, I would like to mention that if you have control or influence on your smart clients, then you may implement 8-box-like access policies, like policy engines. They are cheap and easy to implement and maintain. But if you don't have access to your clients and you want to implement more clear API for your clients, then you can have a look at ACL solutions, for example, Zanzibar as well. And that is all I wanted to share with you. Thank you. And I'm ready to answer your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Vlad. So now you see how implementers are struggle with
Yeah.
policies. Yeah, so this Zanzibar is based on data log, so it's quite nice logical model and theoretically proved. And that's what I think missed from most of access control, that you could not reason about, yeah, potential leaks, data breaks. Okay, guys, any questions to Vlad? Okay, so let's move forward. And we have Brendan as the next speaker. Brendan, welcome.
Thank you so much. Really great to meet everyone who I haven't met before. Let me just get this presentation up. There's a lot of slides, a lot of content, but I think it pairs nicely with some of the stuff we heard. So, an implementer's journey through Divergent authorization. I'm Brendan. I'm head of product at FlexPA. We talk about who I am, who FlexPA is, and why that positions us to see a lot of smart on FHIR, a lot of FHIR, and a lot of weird shit. So, who am I, and how did I get into the weird world of FHIR? Weird world of FHIR. Let's take a step back. When I present, I have 3 goals. One is the G.I. Joe principle. I want to illuminate, enlighten, and teach. The second is the Maximus principle. I want to interest and entertain, hence memes are ever going to sprinkle without, and some jokes. And then the Dewey principle. I strive to not be inaccurate, erroneous, or offensive. So if I am, especially if Josh Mandel's hanging out here, he can call my shit, as well as many of you. But who am I? I started my career at Epic in 2012. worked over in the Netherlands with some of the Ziekenhuizen we talked about. And that's a picture of me in tulips. Just kidding. That's a random picture of the Netherlands. I went to Redox, an interoperability company, started to get into FHIR. I'd heard of FHIR at Epic, but had done some other things, some other integration types, more ancient in their nature. And then still did that at Redox with HL7 version 2, but got more into FHIR as it started to take off. I lived in San Francisco at the time. I then went to Zeus, another interoperability company, more focused on virtual care providers. I moved up to Portland, Oregon. Zeus is based out of Boston. Zeus uses a FHIR data store. So I started to really get into the nuts and bolts. But then FLEXPA is a patient access company, again, to Plaid. And we're connected to CMS patient access APIs, which are all FHIR. So I also write an API newsletter, including FHIR, that you can check out at helpapiguide.substack.com. And it's very infrequent, but hopefully rich content. So yeah, started as HL7 analyst, like Mario, loving pipes, went to CDA evangelist in the Netherlands, helping them stand up some BHZ Nictus stuff, some document exchange, and then have pivoted to APIs. Anyway, I may be ahead of product, but I do commit. So there's my street cred. Anyway, who's FLEXPA? I'm going to go through sort of like a changed version of a piece of our sales deck by Angela, one of our team, the head of design. So if it looks better than the rest of the deck, it's because of her. So like I said, FLEXPA helps applications embed claims data via FHIR APIs that were mandated from the CMS in the US. So we go to every insurer in the US, connect to their APIs that are legally mandated to be there, and then deal with all the differences. Somebody said, is FHIR plug and play? Is Smart on FHIR plug and play? No, it's not. It's distinctly not. It's about as plug and play as HL7. The great advantage is the API ecosystem that comes with it and the internet native technologies and the open documentation. But plug and play is fighting against the human nature of entropy. There's this implementing something because of so many people's different brains means there's implementation and entropy. And the beauty of an aggregator like FLEXPA or many other companies is to simplify that access. So we act as a historical claims gateway and we fight against entropy. Anyway, that's us. You don't care about us that much. We're much like Plaid. Patient jumps in, they choose their health plan. There's a consent screen that we present. We jump out to the payer and they authorize us. So we jump to the authorization URL. They fill in their username and credential. It passes back an authorization code, which we exchange at a token endpoint for a access token, and potentially an ID token and a refresh token. And then we continue to power novel applications with claims data. So there's all the resources we typically see across these endpoints. Claims is the big one. There's some clinical stuff that payers make available. It's useful in its aggregative properties. It's less useful in the sense that it's not as timely or as interesting as the clinical data from providers, from doctors, but still a good perspective. So what do we think about FHIR at FLEXPA, or at least what do I think about FHIR? Standards are a battle against entropy. And like the standard itself battles against proprietary formats, and then you have IGs that battle one layer deeper against the entropy inherent to the standard, and then so on and so forth. We continue to try and be more precise, but there's always differences. Obviously FHIR is great for query-based exchange, a big upgrade over HL7 version 2. Instead of the hey list and broadcast, it's a you up and they respond. We love the open documentation. HL7 now has open documentation for everything, but historically you paid, and X12, these other standards you pay. So that's not how it's supposed to be. The great community, chat.phir.com, at Health Dev Hub, there's these great communities, developer communities. And developer communities are actually exceedingly hard to make correctly, having tried and failed at many companies. So that's a powerful thing. That's a really powerful thing. The FHIR tools, there's so many good ones. They continue to expand. And obviously Health Samurai and AidBox is really, really good. Having connected to almost every FHIR server, props to them. They've only have a sprinkling of the payer market, but I wish they had more because of the superior experience to many. The things we don't like about it are the adoption mirage. The things in the docs don't exist in the wild. That sucks when you want to use nutrition resource and it's not there. And then divergent implementations, the entropy, the consistent entropy. I think scheduling is one that I used to bring up in this sort of presentation of how 3 different EHRs have 3 different scheduling ways to do open scheduling. This really basic concept that we want to get to at a broad national or international level, just dramatically different operations, resources, etc. The one I'm going to talk to about today is implementation divergence of authorization. And you can use this trope. You hear it in almost every technical presentation. If you've heard about X once, or if you heard about 1X, if you've seen 1X, you've seen 1X. It's like, if you've seen one version of HL7 V2, you've seen one version of HL7 V2. It doesn't scale. And that's because of entropy, this idea that standards, even when fairly precise in what you should do, people's own interpretations, their lack of reading, all these different things combined to entropy, to needing to deal with implementation specific variants. I'm going to reference the material from our CTO, Josh Kelly, one of the smartest Joshes I know, the other being Josh Mandel. So yeah, rock and roll. What's smart on FHIR? It's a really nicely documented spec, but largely speaking, it is OAuth with discoverable configuration. Very cool feature. Predefined scopes that should be used, but aren't necessarily. And then some optional authorization with launch. There's some other stuff, undoubtedly, but those are the big ones. So as we talk about variants, implementation variants, I'm going to use the classic Oscar Gamble quote. They don't think it be like it is, but it do. To sort of talk about auth standards. How they don't think it be like it is when it comes to discoverable configuration. That is, what does the spec say about the way we discover for a FHIR server? The smart on FHIR spec says, in order to get this launch context and authorization information and the scopes that are acceptable, you can use an endpoint to pull this, to do this discovery. And that's the well-known smart config. And it should be available, and it gives you some really beautiful detail about what's going on. On top of that, there's a metadata endpoint for a capability statement, and people overload that with some authorization information. They usually put the authorization URL and the token URL into the metadata endpoint. Both of these should be open to the world to discover. There shouldn't be this auth, because you're saying, hey, I'm a server, here's the capabilities, here's how you can go do your stuff. However, and how they think it should be is that you get these beautiful little JSONs that say, here's the types of grants we support. Here are here's the URLs that you can go to for authorization and tokens. Here are the scopes we support. If they don't have that, or sometimes, but in addition to that, they also have this capability statement, and then in these extensions, these fairly standard extensions, you get a token URL, an authorized URL, maybe a management URL, a revocation URL. So that's kind of nice. It doesn't give you scopes, but it gives you some auth stuff. And in a discoverable, in a way that's not out of band, that's not readable via documentation necessarily. How it actually do? What do we see in the wild? We see that only 43% of servers for these payers that we integrate with support well-known smart config. I don't know if it's the difficulty of .well-known smart configuration instead of metadata. I sometimes think it's just the URL is tricky for them to think about. But only 43%, and then only 85% support metadata, and even but a smaller percentage of that actually hide metadata behind patient authorization. So you can only figure out the capability statement once you've once you've connected and then start to pull resources, which is just bad design. It's just bad implementation. But it's that entropy. It's entropy. how they think it be like it is, how it should be according. This is from Smart on Fire. These are these standard scopes. These are the building blocks, the basing building blocks of using FHIR in these FHIR servers, and they should probably use them. So what are some of what do we see? Do we see these standard scopes? What we see is a scope cloud. If you've seen word clouds, these are scope clouds. And there's just all these variations. And some don't matter that much, like capitalization and I mean, some different variations of patient read. You know, do you put the asterisk before after? Those are minor flaws. But when you compound it with no discoverable configuration, it's like sort of like bashing like a monkey against the keyboard to figure out what scopes are actually accepted. Sometimes you can do wildcards, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you have random, custom scopes like interop, or what was the other one? FHIR health records, or HCSC interop scope, or whatever this beast is. This is a fully qualified patient read. Anyway, this is just a subset. There's just so much scope. There's scope shit out there. You just have to ask them and they get it wrong. Anyway. Compounded with that is these scopes are super fundamental to using this API. When I authorize and get the token, I want to look at that token and see the patient that I'm talking about. I don't want to have to just go and blindly guess at a patient ID. I need to know who that patient is. So OpenID, I should get an ID token. FHIR user, I should get a FHIR user attribute within the ID token that says the FHIR resource that pertains to the launch. And offline access. Refresh tokens are really, really valuable. How it actually do, 9% of endpoints have problems with OpenID scope, if they even support that workflow. Some of them accept OpenID and don't give back an ID token. FHIR user, 31% of endpoints don't support the FHIR user attribute. And sometimes even if they accept it, they don't actually do it. They don't actually return that attribute. And offline access, 46% of endpoints don't support it. Although some do support refresh tokens, even though they don't accept this scope. So it all compounds to be really, really confusing. The last piece I'll talk about is the places you actually see a patient ID in the token response is wildly varied. So in the actual endpoint token response, not in the access token or the ID token, there's often a patient field. It's very nice, very standard. We like that one. But sometimes you have to go to that ID token and just sort of search through every attribute, because the FHIR user attribute that's defined in Smart on FHIR is not typically there, or is not there all the time. So you search through all these different fields, like logical member ID. Then the same thing for the access token. Sometimes they don't return an ID token, and you get back an access token, then have to search through all those fields and say, is this the right one? Last two places, sometimes it's a callback URL param. So just not even in the token response body, it's just free, have some free text as a param in the URL. And sometimes you just don't get one, and you're supposed to just go search, like just make a extraneous base URL patient call, and they restrict your search to just patient. But some servers barf at that. So you see wild varieties in that entropy. So what the takeaway is that most smart auth implementations are still pretty dumb. They don't understand or implement basic and useful concepts. So when you do it, make sure you do it these Smart on FHIR to spec. It makes just everyone's life so much freaking easier. FlexBut exists to eat the pain for our customers of Divergent authorization. This is our team. If anyone was like, hell yeah, Brendan, that was awesome, we have open positions, so feel free to apply because we're hiring. So with that, I am complete on my presentation.
Thank you, Brendan. So I hope you've seen comments from Josh. Yes, Josh, maybe you can sound it.
Let's see. Keep in mind that payers have much less consistent support for these APIs because it's not required of them. They don't have to pass test suites like Inferno. be interesting to hear whether EHR endpoints are more consistent since they are required to comply and do it past Inferno. Well, they do have to have these APIs. CMS requires them if they have the certain plan types.
They don't have exactly these though.
Fair. It's a recommended set of IGs, or yeah, fair. Like, and we can get more prescriptive in our regulation to deal with this. But still, like, you're coming up with things you'd imagine that they just use smart or something. The basic parts of like auth are what's so surprising. I get FHIR resource level deviations, but there's some it's just wild how much time we have to spend on auth configurations and guesswork.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the good test suite, I think, the key. So let's do test-driven smart on fire implementations. Yes. So we have Inferno. We even tried to pass. We passed Inferno. So but I still think it's quite. It doesn't test too deep. Yes, I would expect more detailed test suite. So eventually somebody will write it.
Yeah, I think the Karen Alliance is actually collecting feedback to submit to both Inferno and the CMS to like try and progress things here, but it's human nature. No matter how prescriptive you get, there's going to be implementation level deviance because people think in different ways and people read in different ways and people make mistakes in different ways. So that's part of our mission at FlexPen. It's part of I think anyone who deals with integrations mission.
But still think that most of examples you showed that they can be quite easily detected by test suite.
Yeah, these are organizations that don't intend to be following the rules. They might have read the rules, they might have thought about them and decided that they don't need to or they don't choose to. And so Brendan is obviously right that even once you clear away those issues, there are still more. But today we have this low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, more regulation. Let's do it. I'm into it. But yeah, I could also go on about the content and the deviation there, because certainly we see basic resources you would think to be standardly included for these regulated entities. Some aren't including coverage. Some aren't including explanation of benefit, which is wild because like those are pretty basic to what the regulation says. So people can read.
Or maybe you can just
ways.
start shame board and create a dashboard with all the problems of smart on fire implementation and with funny pictures, so the people will recognize.
Yeah, just pin up United and like a funny yeah.
So
well, thanks for letting me. Thank you for letting me speak. It's been interesting to listen to people and to speak.
Thank you, Brendan. So we have a last speaker, Vish.
Thank you. Good afternoon, all. Myself, Vishwasrao Salunkhe. Today, I'll be presenting about the Smart on Fire demo application, which involves basic steps during the Smart on Fire flow within the EHR launch. There are two kinds of launch, but I'll mostly talk about the EHR launch. So the agenda. Yeah, we'll talk about on high level, what are the steps involved into smart app launch within the EHR. I'll little bit talk about Logica Sandbox because I'll be using that for demoing purpose. Then the actual demo and some of the references. So on high level, these are the 6 steps involved into smart app launch. First one is you have to register your application within the EHR, either through EHR provided portal or through the endpoint. And this is just one-time activity, right? Where you go and provide your launch URL, redirect URL, and define your scope, what scopes your app will be using, right? And at the end, you will get the client ID and maybe client secret also in terms of the secret symmetric registration. Then once that step is completed and EHR practitioner launches the application within EHR, that is second step, which is EHR launch, where you get the request into your application once the app is launched within the EHR. The next step is we get the metadata of that FHIR server, either through metadata endpoint or well-known configuration. to look out for the authorization endpoint and the token endpoint, right? And then you get the authorization code by calling that authorization token endpoint, and then providing your client ID, scope, and other details. Once you get the authorization code, you use that authorization code to get the access token. And the access token will be used to actually fetch the clinical data or FHIR API from the FHIR server. So this diagram depicts the flow basically. I'll not go into details of each of those things, but on a high level, when you launch the application, it gets the URL, and along with that, you get some of the other parameters like issuer, which is the FHIR endpoint, and the launch, which is one opaque identifier. Then you actually send the request to authorization server to get the authorization code with launch and other parameters like your client ID, scope, redirect URL, and stuff like that. And then you will be presented, or practitioner will be presented with the consent screen, right? And then it will be having all the details like where the application will be redirected once you approve, what scope that application is requesting. Once we click on the approve button, we get the authorization code. And with authorization code, you go to again to get the access token. And once you receive the access token, you can actually request for the clinical data which is needed for your application. And that completes the flow for EHR app launch. As I'll be using the Logica Sandbox, Logica Sandbox is the freely hosted and open source sandbox used mostly for testing purpose. This provides a lot of features and functionalities when it comes to developing and testing smart on FHIR applications. Like, for example, some dummy patient data generated with using Cynthia, the place where you can register your applications, and you have different roles, personas you can create there. It provides the EHR simulator, which simulates the basically EHR flow, where you can actually see your app being launched within the iframe and how it will look like. You can provide EHR provided sandboxes, but most of the time you do not have control over there. You have to deal with whatever the patient data or dummy data they have created for your testing purpose. So Logica Sandbox comes in handy when you want to create multiple set of scenarios of your clinical data for testing purpose. And I'll show you actually when you go for the demo, different aspects of it. This is what like my patients look like into Logica Sandbox. Moving to actually demo, let me go ahead and launch the application, start the application. So this is just a sample application I have created. It has two parts of it. One is the front end being developed using Vue.js and Vue.5 framework, and back end using Next.js and TypeScript. For simplification, I just kept the registration into JSON file here and using it. But for real life scenario, you will be actually storing those details into somewhere in the database in secure place. You don't need to worry about the client ID and client secret for now, because even though they are showing it here, I'll be deleting after the demo. So for our use case, I created two sample applications, right? SAF Demo App 1 and SAF Demo App 2. And the registration, like who is the issuer for that application? What is the client ID and client secret once we register applications with EHR? What scope this application will be using? What is the launch URL and what is the redirect URL for that application? And just for variation, what clinical data that application is needing, right? So your one application might require different set of clinical resources versus other applications might need different. For this application, let's say I'm just looking for patient resource and condition resource. And for, let's say, another application, I am looking for patient and observation resources. Right? Now, let me go back here and show the Logica Sandbox. So this is actually Logica sandbox, where I created a one R4 sandbox and registered 2 applications here, which you just shown into the code. Once you go to the settings, you can see the client ID, client secret, what is the launch URL, and your callback URL, the scope for that application. Now, when the application is launched, you'll get this endpoint hit along with the issuer and launch. So I'm just into while registering application, I'm differentiating application 1 versus application 2 by configuring this launch URL in a specific way. For this application, it will be SOF Demo App 1. But if application 2 is launched, it will actually pass it to SOF Demo App 2 so that I can grab that path parameter and then look for the specific app registration into my side. You can see different patients created into this sandbox. These are realistic patients, not real. I have created using Cynthia. Different personas like practitioners and all those. This one is a very handy place, launch scenarios where you can actually configure your applications along with specific practitioner, specific patient, and different launch parameters or launch context parameter you can use. Here I have configured, I will launch the SOF Demo App 1 using Susan Clark as a persona or practitioner, and it should launch Daniel Johnson as a patient, and it should pass some encounter resource as part of the launch context. So I can launch the application using here, as well as I can use the EHR simulator as well. Let me launch the application 1 from here, and then I'll show the another application from EHR simulator. So as you can see, the once application is launched successfully, these are the steps happen, and at each step, you can see when application is launched, auth init, you get that application name, right? And the issuer, which is nothing but FHIR endpoint, and the launch parameter, which is one opaque identifier. Next step, we actually get the well-known configuration for that FHIR endpoint, which involves different like metadata about the FHIR server, like authorization endpoint, token endpoint, and scopes. You take this authorization endpoint and pass your client ID, client secret scopes to get the authorization code. Once authorization, in this step, you receive the authorization code along with the state parameter you passed. You use the authorization code to get the access token, and as a response to access token, you have the response, you get the access token here, which you use for getting the clinical data. Along with that, you get launch context parameters like scope, what patient this application is launched with, and what encounter that application is launched with, as well as the ID token as well. Then you use this access token to query the FHIR server and get the clinical data. So if you see, for this application, I need patient resource, and along with that, it's condition resource. So I received that from the FHIR server using that access token. For second application, I might launch using the EHR simulator, where let's say, now here we can see it's simulating the EHR workflow, where you can see the patient demographic here and practitioner details. And in demo applications, the workflow goes same, but at this time, I'm actually application is being launched within the EHR in iframe, and all the data flow happens in the same way. But in this case, while getting the patient data, I'm getting patients as well as it's all observation resources. Coming back to presentation, the references I use are the Smart on for app launch one, then the GitHub repository for this code, where I put the code, for the front end and back end, Logica sandbox, and launch context detail. Basically, I want to just take this as a use case and show what steps happen in the back end when we actually launch the application using EHR workflow.
Thank you, Vish.
That's it from me. Yeah.
The question, how long are you working on Smart on Fire application? And how much it took take the time to get familiar and feel confident that you can write Smart on Fire?
Yeah, I mean, it's like getting started with the Smart on Fire. I think there are quite good number of resources, and we can get started within a few weeks or
how
months.
much did you spend on this?
Yeah, I'm currently like working upon a couple of years on Smart on Fire. My experience with that is getting started is quite easy, like pretty straightforward. But when it comes to integrating with EHR, like as Brandon mentioned about different EHR vendors or different fire servers has different implementation, right? When you work with Epic versus Cerner with other vendor, right? There you go into much of the complexity because EHR vendor one has implemented in a one way. So your application might work with them in a pretty straightforward way. But when you go to other vendor to integrate in there, so they are having different way of implementing those steps. That's where you actually go into much complex thing. And then you need to basically have customization or configuration based on the HR vendor, based on the Fire version, and differentiation based on that.
Okay, thank you, Vish. Guys, any questions to Vish?
Yeah, I have a question to Vish. It might be a question to the floor, actually. I did a little more research on SSO. In terms of the Smart on Fire launch, when you hit the authorization server with the authorization endpoint and you pass in scope equals launch, you can pass in a bunch of scopes, user read, patient read, whatever, right? If you pass in launch, that should tell the app if you're doing a EHR launch or EMR launch that you're launching from the EMR context to enable single sign-on so you don't have to log in again. Is that sense correct? Because that's what we have for one documentation for one EHR, but another EHR does not have that specific thing. So back to what Brendan was saying about the entropy of differences and of different implementations in IGs. Is it the standard that scope equals launch supposed to enable single sign-on from a Smart on Fire launch inside of EHR versus standalone? If anyone has that answer, I'd really appreciate it.
Sure, this is Josh. I can weigh in on this briefly. The way the specification is written, if you're doing an EHR launch, your app is going to be opened by the EHR in the first place, and it will receive a launch parameter.
Correct.
And then it takes that launch parameter and it passes it along to the authorized endpoint. So that launch parameter gets passed verbatim. You receive something called launch, and then you send something called launch.
I'm talking about the scope equals launch, not the launch.
Right, so that's right. So that's a URL or query parameter called launch. And then in addition, if you need context that the EHR might not otherwise provide, you can include a scope of, for example, launch and patient if you need patient context. That's a hint to the EHR, but the EHR could ignore that hint if it wants to. It's launching your app in context. It's going to give you the context it has. The imperative thing is that you include the launch equals query parameter as you redirect to the authorized endpoint.
Yeah, that's whatever you get originally in the launch endpoint. You pass it into the authorized endpoint. The same launch query param value has to match. Yeah, that I get. I was just wondering about scope equals launch, but I think you answered my question. So you're saying they can ignore that context.
Yeah, I'll include a deep link to the definitions in the spec. I'll put it in the chat here.
Great. Thank you, Josh.
Sure thing.
Okay, thank you, Vish. So, and now we have like 30 minutes to discuss any broader topics. So probably, I don't know, if we have Josh, I would like to ask about what the future of Smart on Fire. What are you guys going to add to it? What the problems you want to solve with the next version of Smart on Fire?
Yeah, so In one sense, the Smart App launch specification has become the target of regulations directly in the US. It's referenced from the ONC's Cures regulations, and the most recent set of proposals now from CMS refer to it directly. And it's also referenced in the IPA, International Patient Access Guides. And what that means is that there's a lot of eyes on the spec and a lot of responsibilities that come with it. So this makes many organizations much more conservative in terms of how we evolve or change the spec over time. There's a certain pressure to make sure we don't do too much too quickly or without feedback. And so that reflects kind of where we are right now in the maturity cycle of the specification. That said, there's a couple of new features coming out in the near term. We have what's called the 2.1 revision to the Smart App Launch Guide, which should be coming out in the next couple of months. And one of the things that it includes is support for a capability called App State, which is the idea that some apps, especially very simple apps that are purely client-side, so maybe just HTML5 and JavaScript. It's a very convenient and easy and safe way to package up apps. But historically, those kinds of apps, they can read data from the EHR, but if they need to store any information, even just user preferences, they have to go and find their own HIPAA-compliant storage and spin up those kinds of services. So the Smart App State capability is one that allows apps to keep a very small amount of data in the EHR associated with a patient record or with a user. And one of the first use cases for this is one that I think is really excellent, which is end-to-end encrypted versions of a patient's data from at home. So Apple has built something like this already in their clinician-facing dashboard. You can install a clinician-facing app from Apple in, I don't know, about 5 or 6 EHRs today, including Cerner and Meditech and Athena Health and a few others. And that dashboard doesn't, what it does is it actually fetches a file that's encrypted. So Apple doesn't want to and does not see the health data in this scenario. Mm-hmm. But in order for that to work, to allow for that end-to-end encryption, the app needs to be able to write the decryption keys into the EHR so that they can be maintained safely. So that's an example of a new feature that's coming in the next version of Smart. It's a very small capability in terms of the API surface area, but it allows for some new patterns of interaction and some better application capabilities. That's in the near term. In the longer term, I also want us to develop, and I think we will develop, some stable patterns for surfacing data from more than one server. So right now, Smart assumes that there's just this FHIR server representing the system of record. You get an access token, you can talk to that server and write any query you want. But in the real world, health systems are complex and multifaceted. They might have one clinical data server from their EHR, but they might also have an imaging server from a PACS vendor, and they might have a genomics server that sits next to all this. And it would be nice if patient-facing apps could just ask for permissions once and get an access token that could be used in that little constellation of servers that together make up the full patient record. So I think we'll be doing some work in terms of communicating what are some auxiliary servers where an app might need to go to fetch data. And the motivating use case right now is how do we provide patient access to imaging data? How do I get my DICOM studies through an API rather than having to drive across town and get a CD-ROM and then order a CD-ROM drive on Amazon in order to be able to see those images? So those are a couple things that are coming.
Mm-hmm. And you see that something like JOTS authorization will be used in these scenarios?
Well, so I think that under the hood, most servers are going to leverage JSON Web Tokens to capture some of these details in a stateless way. I think it's a good pattern. So far, we've avoided describing that at the Smart API level. We've used API calls for things like token introspection to preserve options under the hood so that servers can use their existing conventions and then just allow an app to query rather than expecting an app to directly crack open a token and understand what's inside. We could change that decision over time, but we've been reluctant to over-prescribe how that works. I'll say that in the bigger picture, there are some exciting and interesting things happening in the space of authorization. So one that I've been tracking pretty closely is the GNAP protocol being developed in IETF. And in a lot of ways, this is designed as a successor to OAuth 2. It's the grant negotiation and authorization protocol. So I don't know if one day we'll have a version of SMART that uses GNAP, or whether that's just going to have to be the next thing. And SMART is going to stay in its lane, and we'll start a new project when it's the time to take advantage of some of these new capabilities. Managing some of these changes can be really hard.
Thank you, Josh. And I've seen you're researching like internet identity stuff. Do you think something like this may happen in near future?
Yeah, well, near future is tough. I think that the standards around decentralized identifiers are very interesting and potentially quite powerful, particularly for architectures where a patient wants to bring together a large set of their data into a personal store and then be able to set policies downstream to say things like anybody with a certain credential can access my data. So I think there's like a lot of good building blocks today and some really interesting things that folks are exploring. There's some demos that you can try out. Auth0 has one for playing with decentralized identifiers and sort of what they consider to be mobile wallets. And they have some use cases in healthcare. Microsoft has a set of tools that are deployed sort of for issuing verifiable credentials on top of this technology. But it's still pretty early, and it feels like everybody's assembling these pieces in a slightly different way. So it's, yeah, we're at the stage right now where you can build a pretty compelling example. But whether you're going to use that technology stack with decentralized identifiers and data hubs, or whether you want to look at the work that's happening on the solid protocol from the W3C perspective for personal data stores, there's some convergence of ideas, but the specs are still all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Josh. Okay, guys, any topics to discuss? So we have a nice group. Feel free to unmute yourself, turn on the camera and talk with us. Okay. So I see Isaac left us. I just wanted to ask about Epic support of Smart on Fire plans. Isaac, are you here? No, we don't have Isaac. Okay, Pavel, maybe you have question.
I don't have questions, but what I want to say, I don't know if anybody here was at our FHIR meetup. We had actually in person, and unfortunately, I still regret we don't have recording of that one. It was 2019 in Irvine, and it was a presentation by Vivek Kaliraman, I think, from Handoff Company. And he basically was, all his talk was about how he failed, his company failed to use Smart on Fire like with one of large HR vendors. Like they were like killing themselves for like 9 months, you know, moving from public sandbox to private sandbox to hospital, and like finding the differences at every stage and like finding missing API endpoints, and ended up just, you know, shutting down the whole thing and switching to HL7 v2. And I'm just very excited actually to see how it changed, you know, between 2019, it was October, and now, I mean, it's all in production, many different companies with different HR vendors. I think it's a great progress. I mean, maybe it's not a perfection, you know, Brendan indicated a lot of issues. I mean, we also like build Smart on Fire applications and experience similar stuff, but I mean the progress is very, very, very nice.
Yeah, but what interesting trend I see that we have more and more FHIR native systems, yes, and so it looks like in the near future I see how many startups are aggregating and using FHIR as internal data models. So, and many like next generation EHRs are built on top of FHIR, on top Okay. So that I expect that in near future it will be quite easy to communicate FHIR resources of high quality, because there is a lot of questions to the quality of the data inside FHIR now, but it's getting better and better. So, and Gasper, what do you think? So, was you able to get all the information you need from these EHRs, or there's still some missing parts?
No, we were able to get all the information from the EMRs, but that was purely because we worked on them when the data was being modeled. We didn't have a voice into how the data should be modeled, but we had a voice into what data should be modeled in there. So yeah, the standardizing on the data was done, including, and we were included in that. But due to the restrictions of each EMR, we didn't really have, we couldn't say how they should model it. We just told them what to model. So basically the request form, so the question answers, that was something that we all agreed on. But whether they mapped this to questionnaire or observation or whatever, that's something that we didn't have a voice on. So I think the content part, that's something that the FHIR profiles and IGs have to work on. And those are the ones that will provide quality FHIR resources. And we see this being done on wide scale in the UK, for example. The UK has, the NHS Digital is working a lot on that. In the Netherlands as well. So I think on national scales, those implementation guidelines are the ones that give true power to FHIR.
Did you have a separate backend in your application, or you just worked and everything is coming from the EHR?
We do have we do have our own backend. Basically, it's the integration platform, we call it. And so our front-end facing application goes through our backend, and it's the backend that integrates not only to an EHR, but also to other sources. So I think it was John who previously mentioned the DICOM and also XDS, and we have several data points that we fetch into, that we integrate into, to provide kind of a holistic view on the patient record, and for that tumor board solution. It's not just data coming from an EMR, but it's data coming from multiple sources.
And how you structured your, did you try to adopt FHIR as your internal model, or you just completely?
Yeah, guys are FHIR native.
Okay.
Yeah, we use FHIR, but we try to follow existing guidelines. So for example, for the workflow definition, we follow the IHE XW profile. And for that, we use the FHIR task, for example. For the patient, we obviously use patient. That would be very hard to use anything else for. And for the request form, we use the questionnaire and question response. So we try to be standardized that way, and we hope that others follow, so that we really are plug and play, however that's possible or not, but to the maximum point. So yeah, we do use FHIR, and we try to follow the guidelines.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I have a question regarding the app launch. Did anyone successfully use an IAM solution like Ping Identity, Auth0, or Okta in between launching their app and the actual, and let's say Epic or another EHR solution?
Can you a little bit clarify? Do you mean that double O's, like you have your own identity provider and you want to launch from Epic and then log in into your system, like SSO scenarios? Or
Yeah, SSO scenario where we, instead of just launching our app directly, we wanted to go through a solution like Auth0 or Ping Identity, and basically sort of them acting as a service provider, and from there going to our application, because they have multiple instances of our application. So sort of have like that like Epic being the identity provider, Ping or Auth0 being the service provider, and then our application being the endpoint application of a kind of a regular SSO process.
Theoretically, you can use just double login, and it can be it will be cached. Yes, so the login only should log in twice into Epic and into your application. After that, your application may have both keys. And
Okay. But
Yeah.
we had like issues that after the token response from the token endpoints,
Yeah.
we were getting the details outside of the access token, right? From Epic, for example, outside of the access token or the identity token. So those parameters were not like by default, let's say they were not used by that IAM solution. So they could only get because it's different from the regular OIDC protocol. So they were not they couldn't get to those details. And then with another vendor, we had an issue where just the launch token could not be used in their OAuth flow because they couldn't do anything custom, and launch is not part of the OAuth standard.
I mean, we have integrated in that way with both Epic, Cerner, Chipsoft, EasyCare, and it does work how you have described that it didn't for you. Basically, we did get the context, so the non-standard OIDC scopes claims back, but with the solution that we use, so with the Keycloak, you're able to map that however you please. So you can say, okay, the claim that's called patient ID, I'm gonna take that and add it to the user's attribute. And that's
sorry, what was the solution that you guys used?
Keycloak.
It's open source wallet server, yeah. Keycloak.
Keycloak. Okay, thank you.
And I have another. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Start. Sorry, Jackson. Yeah.
No, I was about to do a topic change. So if you have something there, please go ahead.
No, I'm gonna change topic after you.
Okay, great. So I just have a question about kind of the limits of FHIR or smart on FHIR. And I'm just wondering if anybody could give an anecdote or an example in their developer experience about somewhere where they found that they were running up against some limit that just wasn't going to work with the standard. And, you know, maybe they used HL7 V2 or something. That's something that I've noticed some people talking about, and I'm kind of new to this space, so maybe this is an inappropriate question, but I am curious if someone could share an anecdote about that.
No, that's very interesting question, and the problem is still not yet solved. So if you're talking about HL7 V2, it's a system-to-system integration. Yes, that means you have two persistent system, they function, and then can exchange the feed of changes, and one system can replicate state from another system. And that's worked very nice, and that's how most of distributed system doing this. So the smart on FHIR is API driven, and initially API was, again, it's my opinion, was done for short-living clients. Yes, so you're opening the browser page, it's getting the data, the state from server, do something, maybe save something to the server, and then disappear. So, and I'm talking for a long time about this, that REST API is not the best way to integrate between the systems. So it may work in some situation when you're making some patient portal or something like this, when you aggregating patient data, not all of the patient from external system, yeah, but this specific patient from different systems. Yeah, you can get this data through the REST API and store cache or to do something like this, but you don't have even the way to check that this data was changed. So you need somehow to refresh and go and again send all the requests, save some token, or on the next visit of the user you will be able to request this data. So that's still a problem. Yeah, and I don't know if we still have Josh. Josh, what do you think about this? Smart on FHIR, I don't think it's fit very well for system-to-system integration.
Well, so there's two pieces here, right? The closest that we have in the standard is smart backend services. But that is all about just a server talking to another server directly. It's not necessarily about replication of state between those two servers. So that's the pattern that we use when one system wants to do a bulk export from another system. You can get authorized to do that bulk export using smart backend services. And the bulk export specs, have built some capabilities that are somewhat in the line that you're describing. So for example, the current version of bulk export, which is the second release of that guide, allows for one system to export data, and then a day later or a week later, you can come by and say, tell me what has changed since a certain time. And so you can get information about what has been deleted or what has been updated since that time. I don't think it's necessarily a beautiful or elegant solution, but it does reuse at least the capabilities that are currently in that guide and that are part of the certification program. So it'll become a natural target for folks who are looking to do more.
Mm-hmm. So you mean that we will be able to pull for the changes, yes? Pull for the changes and get.
Yes, I mean, it's polling in the sense that it's client driven, but it's still an asynchronous process where the server responds and says, check back, I'll tell you when I'm ready to give you the answer.
Mm-hmm. Because that was exactly my point. So now we see, for example, these ad hoc integrations through the REST API, but eventually, so the same data will be replicated into different places, but things are still moving and changing, and we will have a lot of copies, slightly modified everywhere, and how to sync all of them. There's a lot of questions. So when I was thinking, I already told on the confederated FHIR meetup that probably something like unique ID for every resource may save us. Maybe not.
Yeah, no, I mean, even so, applying these unique IDs, not just to every resource, but to every version of every resource, there's also this challenge of merging protocols, right? Either you look at what happens in the developer world, like Git, where a developer has to decide how to resolve conflicts, or you look at the semantics that you can get from, CRDT, conflict-free replicated data types, where you're kind of limited in what you can express, or you have to be very clever to make sure you avoid conflicts. It's not, I haven't yet seen a model for branching and merging clinical data that feels really seamless.
Yeah. But to be honest, the most of resources are append only, yes. So not so many changes and observations and conditions. So they are records.
Well, I think spiritually that's right. In terms of the workflow, though, like just what happens when you take a FHIR observation and you mark it as entered in error, or you could think about that as an append, but syntactically it's not. So you have to be careful to spell out those rules about what transitions are allowed, because they're sort of safe and one way.
But eventually I can imagine that one system getting through the FHIR API data from another, and maybe through some loop, this data will get back to the source.
Yes, and if you're unlucky, there's an amplification in that loop as well. So rather than just one payload cycling around, there's exponential growth. I could imagine some very bad outcomes there.
Yeah, and it's just the beginning, yeah. Now people are happy just to get some data, yes, and start working with it, but eventually, yeah, in this integrated world, yeah. So we need something like blockchain for it.
Those will be the problems of our success.
Okay, guys, any other topics, questions? Come on. Oh, Josh, okay, so we are talking. So I remember that you were thinking about like converting V2 feed into FHIR subscription. Is it still in your mind, or?
Yeah, I think we've now laid the groundwork for that to happen with the subscription infrastructure. This first landed in FHIR R4B, so that's the current published version. And it'll be a bit more complete in R5, but all the building blocks are here already. So just to say this briefly, the idea is an authorized client can create a subscription by posting a FHIR subscription resource to the server. And it basically, the subscription says, here's the kind of information I'm interested in. And there's two flavors. One is what we call a resource trigger. And that's essentially the app saying, I'm interested in knowing when certain kinds of resources are created or changed on the server. And it's really a FHIR-centric mechanism. You could think about it as, you could process it through things like FHIR path expressions to detect when that event is triggered. And the other kind of trigger is more opaque. We call them event triggers. And so an app could say, hey, when an event of the following type happens on your server, let me know about it. And we created those event triggers to allow for things like bridging into HL7 version 2. So a server that supports V2 messaging could say, cool, I support event triggers for the following 35 message types, each of which just comes from V2 directly. And if a client subscribes, it would get a notification payload with a set of parameters associated with that event. So we haven't seen this used yet. So I'm not sure how well it will work in practice. There's probably still several dots to connect in terms of, do you want to literally send the V2 message along with this notification? Or do you want to map it into FHIR as a requirement? Or do you want to map it into FHIR as a best effort? We'll need some real world experience to kind of iron out those details. But the core infrastructure for creating the subscriptions and triggering on the events is now in the FHIR spec.
Awesome. Yeah, but it's nice because so the legacy systems can be wrapped into the FHIR subscription protocol.
That's the hope. Yeah, we're trying to lower the bar for those systems to expose what they've got through the newer FHIR interfaces.
And what? Okay, sorry guys, because you're silent. So Josh, what do you think about Zanzibar in this data log style security access control rules?
I mean, I think it's a super cool technology. To take advantage of it, you need to sort of design for it from the beginning, or at least from the inside of your system. So it's very hard to layer that kind of fine-grained policy on after the fact. But if I was designing a system right now, I would absolutely, take one of the open source implementations of that concept and try to build that into my authorization approach.
Okay, guys, last chance to.
I'll throw out a question. Hey everyone, I'm an informaticist at Flatiron Health. So really appreciate Gasper's suggestion that to get better, we need implementation guides. On the EHR vendor side, it's hard to develop a roadmap for more consistent support of the implementation details, because you don't know what the market is for smart on FHIR apps that your sites are going to be interested in. So, and those implementation guides don't exist yet. So suppose that I want to get better here. Like I want, I need to prioritize somehow. I can't boil the ocean. My canonical data layer is not FHIR. There's a lot of work here. So how do I, as a EHR developer, think about this? How do I prioritize it? Where do I look for good guidance on what this implementation should look like?
Gasper?
So I think there are already a couple of great detailed implementation guidelines being published in as I said before, NHS Digital is publishing it in a public registry. So you can look there. NICTIS, for example, is publishing that for Netherlands. So there are already a couple of great and detailed implementation guidelines that you can see as a model or as an example. But I think I'm not sure how you would approach this from the zero. Like if you had a use case that you needed to model yourself and you didn't find a parallel somewhere in some other country, I think that would be hard to do it on your own. You need like
I think you should start the new working group and new implementation guide. Yeah. So there's a lot of work in international patient summary implementation guide. I think it could be very nice, the base for most of implementations. Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's why the national initiatives are the ones that have most power and most weight on them, because they have the leverage to enforce that later on. Because if you go with that as a sole vendor or as a consumer of that, then it's really going to be hard to leverage that and to force that on anyone else. And unless you force that on anyone else, unless it becomes like a national or global even implementation guideline, if it's just you who's using it, you haven't done anything.
So I think the answer, go to FHIR community and discuss with people how and take a look what implementation guides exist. So again, my recommendation is International Patient Summary, IG, which is targeting the globe. And if you, there's a lot of groups and people are working on different domains. So you can just check what the status and if they are quite mature, so you can take it as a foundation.
Thank you.
Okay, guys. So thank you everybody for visiting us. So this is FHIR Health Dev Hub Meetup. So we have a Slack chat with a bunch of experts, and you're welcome to join. Just send the form from Health Dev Hub site. And feel free to help us to organize the next interesting meetup. So if you have some hot topics or real problems you want to solve or some great ideas, please contact us. And let's do it together. So thank you everybody. So have a nice day or night or morning. Bye and especially thank you for Josh and our speakers. Bye.